The morning Mary Wells buried her husband, 3 men brought her casseroles, and 4 men brought her condolences. And not a single one of them brought her what she actually needed, which was someone willing to tell her the brutal truth about what happened to a woman alone in Dust Creek, Texas, in the year 1882. She stood at the grave in her black wool dress, the September sun beating down on the small rise behind the house where she and Thomas had planted a cottonwood tree the first spring they arrived. That tree was 8 years old now, and its roots ran deep into the red Texas soil, and she thought about how strange it was that the tree would outlive the man who planted it. The preacher said words she did not hear. The neighbors bowed their heads. She kept her eyes open, staring at the rough pine box that held what remained of Thomas Wells, who had been 41 years old and had died of a chest infection that moved through his lungs in less than 2 weeks, which was the cruelest kind of dying, because it was fast enough to be shocking but slow enough that she had time to watch it happen. Thomas had been a good man. He had not been a passionate man, but goodness is not nothing, and she had loved him in the steady way of a woman who had married young and grown into something real over 11 years of shared life. They had no children. That was a wound she carried separately from the grief of losing him, a wound that was older and more complicated, and she did not let herself think about it on the day of the burial because there was only so much a person could hold. The well-wishers came to the house afterward. Widow Hatch brought a pie. Old George Tanner brought his hat in his hands and told her Thomas had been a fine man, and Mary said yes, he had been. And then George stood there as if waiting for her to do something interesting, and when she did not, he eventually left. The Calloway family came, and Ruth Calloway pressed Mary's hands between both of hers and looked at her with the particular expression that women give other women when there is nothing useful to say, which is a look made of equal parts tenderness and helplessness. Everyone said the same things. They said they were sorry. They said Thomas was in a better place. They said if she needed anything, anything at all, she should just ask. But they said it the way people say things they hope will not be taken literally, because what could they actually do? Dust Creek was a small town, and small towns ran on their own economies of labor and survival, and nobody had extra time to spend saving a widow from the consequences of being a widow. She owned the house. That was something. She and Thomas had built it 7 years ago on 40 acres of decent grazing land, and they had a small herd, 15 cattle, and a vegetable garden that was reasonable in good years and failing in dry ones, and a barn in fair condition. What they did not have was a mortgage, because Thomas had been careful about debt, which was the thing she was most grateful for in those first days, because it gave her a little time. But time was the shape of the problem, not the solution to it. She was 32 years old. She had a homestead she could not run alone. The cattle needed tending by someone who could ride hard and rope fast, and she could ride but not hard enough, and she could rope but not fast enough. The fields needed plowing in spring, and she could not plow. The barn needed a new roof beam that Thomas had been planning to replace since July, and she did not have the skill or the height to do it safely. And the winter was coming. September in Texas was still warm, but winter came, and with it came the question of firewood and repairs, and whether the water trough would freeze and crack, and all of it added up to a single arithmetic problem that kept her awake at night doing calculations that never came out right. Hector Barnes came to see her on the 3rd day after the burial. He was a rancher from 4 miles north, a wide man with a red face and small eyes, and he was not unkind, but he was very practical in the way of a man who has always seen women as problems to be organized. He sat at her kitchen table and told her he was sorry for her loss, and then, in almost the same breath, he told her that she ought to think about selling. He said the property alone was worth something, and there were buyers who would pay fair, and a woman alone on 40 acres was going to find herself in a very difficult situation come spring. He said it without malice. He said it as though he were pointing out an obvious truth that she might not have considered. She thanked him for his concern and showed him to the door. 2 days after that, Pete Holden came, and he said almost the same thing, except he added that if she was thinking of selling, he would be interested in making an offer, and his smile was slightly too wide. She thanked him for his concern and showed him to the door. On the 8th day after the burial, the Callaway boy young Danny, who was 17, came by to ask if she needed firewood split, and she said yes, and he split 3 cords for her in 2 days, and when she tried to pay him, his mother sent the money back with a note that said, "Do not be foolish." That act of genuine kindness made her cry harder than the burial had. She was making a list at the kitchen table on the evening of the 12th day when she heard boots on her porch and then a knock. It was a firm knock, not aggressive, but not apologetic either. She opened the door and found a man she had seen in town perhaps twice before, never properly met, standing on her porch with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was not the look people had been wearing when they came to see her. His name, she would learn in the next 30 seconds, was Oscar Rourke. He was 36 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who work outdoors in heat, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been weathered by years in the sun into something that was handsome in an undecorated way. He had brown eyes that were direct and calm. His clothes were work clothes, good quality but plainly worn, and he wore a hat that had seen real use. He looked like a man who did things. "Mrs. Wells," he said, "my name is Oscar Rourke. I ranch about 7 miles east of here. I knew your husband from the stockyards in Abilene. We did a cattle drive together 4 years ago, before you had settled this property. He was a decent man, and I was sorry to hear what happened. I am not here to tell you that." She waited because clearly there was more. "I am here because I have been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposition that might be useful to you if you are willing to hear it. It is a business proposition, nothing improper." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not flinch, and he did not look at the ground, and he did not smile too wide. He just looked at her with those calm brown eyes and waited. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I will put coffee on." He sat at her kitchen table in the same chair where Hector Barnes had sat, and the difference was immediate and hard to name but entirely real. Barnes had sat with the comfort of a man in his own territory. Oscar Rourke sat with the contained attention of a man who understood he was a guest. She set the coffee in front of him and sat across the table, and she said, "Let me hear it." He set his hat on his knee and leaned forward slightly, and he said, "Here is what I know. You have 15 head of cattle, 40 acres, a house, and a barn. You need a roof beam replaced, probably 3 or 4 other structural repairs before winter, and you need someone to handle the cattle work through the fall and winter months at minimum. You are likely hearing from people that you should sell. 2 people," she said, "both of them interested in buying." "That does not surprise me," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not condemnation, just acknowledgement. "Here is what I propose. I have 30 head of cattle and 22 acres. If we combine our herds and work the land together through the winter, come spring we will both be in a better position. You keep your property, I keep mine. We split the labor and the profit from what we sell in spring. I can fix the roof beam and the other repairs myself, and you provide the house as working headquarters since it is more centrally located. You would maintain full ownership of your land and cattle throughout." She looked at him. "That is an unusual proposition. It is a practical one. Most people would say it is improper. 2 unmarried people sharing work on the same land. Most people are not the ones trying to figure out how to keep 40 acres solvent through a Texas winter alone," he said, and there was no edge in it, just plain fact. "I am not proposing to move in. I would ride in each morning from my property, and we would work through the day. I am proposing a business arrangement, Mrs. Wells. If it helps you keep your land, the gossip seems like the lesser problem." She stared at the coffee in her cup. She was thinking about Hector Barnes' smile and Pete Holden's too wide smile, and about the list she had been making at this table for 12 days, and about how none of the condolences and none of the casseroles had addressed a single line on that list. "What do you get out of it?" she asked. "Access to your water well," he said, And then, with the faintest shift in his expression that was almost a smile, "Mine has been giving me trouble since June. Your property also has the better grazing in the eastern section, which would benefit the combined herd." She looked up at him. "You know my property." "I have been thinking about this for 4 days," he said simply. "I did not want to come here and waste your time." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening insects were beginning, and the cottonwood rustled in a small wind, and somewhere up on the rise the grass moved over Thomas's grave, and she thought about what it would mean to say yes and what it would mean to say no. "I will think about it," she said. "That is fair," he said. He finished his coffee, stood, took his hat from his knee. "I will come by day after tomorrow if that is agreeable. You can give me your answer then, and if the answer is no, I will leave you be and not make it strange. And if I have more questions," she said. He reached into his jacket and set a folded piece of paper on the table. "I wrote down everything I was proposing with the numbers I have worked out. It is something to look at while you are thinking." She stared at the paper. Then she looked up at him. Something was shifting in her chest that she could not name, something that was not romantic, not yet, but was the beginning of a recognition. He had done the thing nobody else had done. He had come to her with a document, with numbers, with a plan. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Mrs. Wells," he said, and then he put his hat on and he walked out the door, and she heard his boots on the porch and then the quiet of the evening again. She unfolded the paper and read it 3 times. He came back 2 days later at the same hour in the evening, and she had the door open before he knocked. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Good. I will start on the roof beam Monday." That was how it began. He arrived on Monday with lumber strapped to his horse, and a second horse loaded with tools. He did not ask her to help with the roof beam because he did not need help with it, but when she came out and stood below the barn watching him work, he did not tell her to go away either. He explained what he was doing as he did it, not in the way of a teacher to a student, but in the way of a person thinking aloud who does not mind company. She watched him work for 2 hours. He was precise and unhurried. He tested every joint before he trusted it. He did not take shortcuts. She decided she trusted him. By Wednesday they had fallen into an easy working pattern. He arrived before 7 each morning and they discussed the day over coffee, just 10 or 15 minutes, practical and focused, going over what the cattle needed, what the weather looked like, what jobs needed doing in order of priority. He spoke to her as an equal in this conversation, asking her opinion, accepting it when she was right, explaining his reasoning when he disagreed. On the 3rd Wednesday, they had a genuine disagreement about the eastern fence line, which she thought needed replacing all the way to the creek, and he thought only needed patching in 4 specific places. They argued it back and forth across the kitchen table for 15 minutes with the maps of the property spread between them, and she realized partway through that she was enjoying herself, which was a startling thing to notice while discussing fence posts. He turned out to be right about the fence line. She told him so. "You had a good argument about the creek section," he said. "I am going to check it again in spring." "You do not have to concede a point I did not win," she said. "I am not conceding. I am telling you I will look at it again." He rolled up the map. "There is a difference." October came, and with it the first real cool, and the leaves on the cottonwood turned gold. Oscar replaced the second repair. She had identified a section of the house foundation that had been settling badly, and she helped him with it, handing him materials and holding the level, learning things she had not known before about how a house was kept together. They ate lunch together on work days, sitting on the porch with bread and hard cheese and whatever she had made that morning, and the conversations moved outward from the work. She learned that he had come to Texas from Kansas in 1875, that he had been briefly married in 1879 to a woman named Clara who had died of typhoid in 1880, and that he carried that grief quietly in the way of a person who has learned to live beside a wound without constantly examining it. "I am sorry," she said, when he told her about Clara. "Thank you," he said, and she saw in his eyes that he was tired of people saying that, not because it was unkind, but because it changed nothing, and he appreciated that she left it there without expanding it into the kind of sympathy that expected something back. She talked about Thomas. Oscar listened in the same way she was learning to recognize as characteristic of him, fully, without interrupting, without trying to redirect the conversation towards something more comfortable. He asked quiet questions that showed he was paying attention. He did not tell her Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, which was a phrase she had heard 3 times from 3 different people, and which she had found almost insupportable, not because it was wrong but because it was deployed like a permission slip, as though her feelings needed someone else's approval to exist. What do you think he would have thought about this arrangement? Oscar asked one afternoon, nodding generally toward the working property. He would have liked it, she said after thinking. Thomas was practical. He would not have wanted me to lose the land to sentiment. She paused. He would have wanted to inspect your numbers first. He would have been right to, Oscar said. She looked at him. Were the numbers honest? Yes, he said simply. You could have had them checked by anyone. I figured you might. She had not, she realized. She had trusted them. She did not know exactly when she had started trusting him. November came in with hard wind, and they moved the cattle to the better sheltered section of grazing land that crossed both their properties. The combined herd 45 head now, between them was strong, and Oscar's eye for cattle was good. He noticed a calf with a bad leg before she did and fixed it and was matter-of-fact about having saved the animal's life. You were raised around cattle, she asked. My father ran 500 head in Kansas, he said. I was roping before I could read. Could you read eventually? She asked, and it came out with a dry edge that surprised her. He looked at her with something that was definitely amusement now. I read better than I rope, he said. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since September. They were both still for a moment after that, because the sound of her laughter surprised them both. And then he smiled, not the too wide smile of Pete Holden or the polite smile of neighbors, but a real smile that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and she thought suddenly that he was a genuinely attractive man, and then she thought about thinking that, and then she put her attention very firmly on the cattle. But the thought had been thought, and thoughts do not unthink themselves. In December, the temperature dropped severely for a week, the kind of cold that Texas got occasionally and was badly equipped for. Oscar drove his cattle the full 7 miles to her property because the shelter was better, and for 3 days he stayed in the barn rather than riding back and forth in brutal cold, sleeping on the hay with his horse and 2 blankets and a lantern. She brought him dinner each evening, and they ate together in the barn, where the animal warmth made it tolerable. And one night the wind got bad enough outside that they talked until nearly midnight, and she forgot entirely to feel proper about sitting in her own barn talking to a man after dark. He told her about the cattle drive he had done with Thomas 4 years ago, 600 miles north through Indian Territory to Abilene. He said Thomas had been the best trail cook he ever rode with, which made her laugh because Thomas had never cooked anything at home except coffee. He only knew how to cook for 15 men at once, she said. It did not scale down. He used to make a beef stew that men from 3 different outfits would stop by the fire for, Oscar said. He smiled at the memory, and in the amber lantern light he looked different from how he looked in daylight, and she was aware of him in a way she had been trying not to be aware of him for several weeks. You were friends, she said. We were friendly, he said. Thomas was not a man who let you close quickly, but I liked him. No, she said. He was not. She looked at the lantern. He let me close eventually. I know, Oscar said. He talked about you on the trail, not constantly, but when he talked about you, you could tell it mattered. She was quiet for a moment, and the wind moved against the barn walls and the horses shifted. I appreciate you telling me that, she said. It is true, he said. I only tell you what is true. She looked at him then directly, and he met her eyes, and neither of them looked away for a moment that lasted a breath or 2 longer than necessary. And then the wind hammered the barn door, and she stood and said she ought to get inside before the temperature dropped further. And he said good night. and she walked through the cold dark to the house with her breath making white clouds in the moonlight. And she stood inside the door for a moment with her hand still on the latch, not thinking about anything particular. Just standing there. The cold broke on the fourth day and Oscar drove his cattle home, and life resumed its working pattern, but something had changed in the texture of it. She noticed things she had not let herself notice before. She noticed that when she was talking he gave her his whole attention, that brown-eyed focused quiet that made her feel as though what she was saying was the most relevant thing happening in his world. She noticed that he had a patience with the animals that was absolute, that she had never seen him use force when patience would serve. She noticed that when he disagreed with her, he disagreed directly and without softening it, which she found she vastly preferred to the careful circling manner of men who were unsure how honest to be with a woman. She also noticed that he was careful not to presume on the arrangement. He did not come in the evenings unless she invited him. He knocked before entering any building. He maintained the lines of a business arrangement with a courtesy that was genuine, not formal, and she understood that this was not because he was indifferent to her, but because he was someone who did not take things that were not offered. Christmas approached. Ruth Calloway organized a gathering at the church, which was the town's main social event of the winter, and Mary went, and Oscar went, and they arrived separately and greeted each other across the room, and both accepted the knowing looks of half the town with identical expressions of mild unconcern. But during the Christmas supper, they ended up beside each other, and he refilled her cider glass without asking because he had noticed it was empty, and she caught the expression on Ruth Calloway's face and had to look away to compose her own. After the supper, some of the men from the town played fiddle and there was dancing on the church floor, and the dancing was the easy kind, neighborly, no ceremony to it, and most of the adults danced with whoever was beside them. Oscar asked her if she danced. "I used to," she said. "It comes back," he said, and he held out his hand. It was a real, not a slow dance, and they moved through it with the crowd of other dancers, laughing at the errors and catching each other when the steps went wrong. And she put her hand in his and was spun around and came back to him and was spun the other way. And it was nothing at all except dancing, and it was also, she admitted privately, entirely wonderful. His hand on her waist when they came together in the pattern of the reel was proper and firm and brief, and she was warm from the dancing and the cider and the lamplit room, and she was happy, which she had not expected to be by December. In the new year, 1883, the work of the combined ranch entered its slower winter phase, and there was more time to talk. She had begun keeping a record of the herd in a notebook, accounting for every head, tracking weights and health, and she showed it to Oscar one morning and he went through it with a focused attention that was transparent admiration. "You have a better head for numbers than most ranchers I know," he said. "Thomas kept the books," she said. "I watched and learned. He was better at the doing and I was better at the tracking. A useful division," Oscar said. He handed the notebook back and their fingers brushed, and neither of them mentioned it, but her awareness of him sharpened for the rest of the morning. In February, two things happened that changed the pace of everything. The first was that Pete Holden, who had been watching the arrangement between Oscar and Mary with a dissatisfaction he did not hide well, stopped Oscar in town and made remarks about what a man and a woman alone on a property implied, and the tone was unpleasant enough that two men standing nearby moved closer in the way that indicates readiness. Oscar did not raise his voice. He said, with a quietness that was somehow more forceful than volume, that Mrs. Wells was running a business partnership with him and that she was a woman of character and integrity, and that if Holden had an opinion about a woman he had never properly met, Holden ought to consider whether that opinion had been earned. He said it with such flat certainty that Holden ran out of places to stand in the conversation and eventually went away. Mary heard about it from Ruth Calloway the next day. "He did not fight him?" she asked. "Not a blow," Ruth said. "He just talked him to ground." Holden looked like a man who had been stepped on but could not identify the shoe. Mary was quiet for a moment, Then she said, "I would have liked to have seen that." The second thing was the letter from Thomas's brother. His name was Leonard Wells, and he wrote from Ohio, and the letter was full of the kind of formal condolence that comes from people who did not truly know the person who died. But buried in it was a legal matter. Thomas had apparently taken a loan from Leonard before he died, a loan of $120 that Leonard had not previously mentioned to Mary and now wished to call in, with interest. Mary sat with the letter for a long time. She did not know if the loan was real. She did not know if Leonard could legally compel her to pay. She did not know anything about the law as it pertained to a widow's obligation for her husband's debts when those debts were not in her name. She showed the letter to Oscar at their morning coffee, and for a moment she felt the familiar anxiety of wondering how he would respond, whether he would tell her to be calm, to trust in God's providence, to think positively. He read the letter. He set it down. He said, "I know a lawyer in Abilene. He handles property and estate matters. I can write to him today and ask about your legal standing on this." She looked at him. "The loan may or may not be real," Oscar said. "Even if it is real, a widow in Texas has protections under the Homestead Act that Leonard Wells may not be aware of. The house and land are almost certainly exempt from claims of this kind, but you need someone with legal knowledge to tell you that properly, not just me." "Can we afford a lawyer?" she said, meaning the partnership. "I will handle the cost," he said. "We can settle it in spring accounting if you prefer." "I do prefer," she said. Not because she could not accept generosity, but because she wanted to remain standing on her own ground. "Of course," he said. He wrote the letter that afternoon, and she watched his handwriting, which was clear and direct, like the man himself. The lawyer wrote back in 2 weeks confirming what Oscar had suspected: the Homestead Act protected the property, and a personal loan not secured in Mary's name could not be held against her land or house. She wrote back to Leonard with the legal information included politely, and he did not write again. After the lawyer's letter, she sat with Oscar on the porch in the late February cold, both of them with coffee, and she said, "Every other person who came here after Thomas died told me they were sorry and offered me their sympathy." "I know," he said. "You came and offered me something I could actually use," she said. He looked at her. "Sympathy is real," he said carefully. "I'm not dismissing it. Those people cared." "They did," she said, "but caring and doing are different things." "Yes," he said, "they are." She looked at the cottonwood on the rise, its bare winter branches against the pale sky. "I have been thinking about what it means that you came here with a plan instead of a condolence," she said. "I have been thinking about it for months." He was quiet, watching her with that patient attention. "I think it means something about who you are," she said. "It might mean I am not very good at condolences," he said. "No," she said. "I think it means that when you see a problem you cannot accept it. You look for the answer." He was still, and she could see that her assessment mattered to him. "I did not like the idea of you losing this land," he said. "It seemed wrong. You had built something here." "We had built something," she said. "Thomas and I." "Yes," he said. "And you had not finished building it." She felt the particular ache of that phrase because it was true in more ways than he knew. She and Thomas had not finished. But she was sitting here in February, with her land still hers and her cattle healthy and her accounts organized and the foundation of her house stabilized, and none of that was where she had been in September, and the person most responsible for the difference was sitting beside her on this porch. "Oscar," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and he heard the change in it, and he turned to look at her. "I want to say something without it being strange." "All right," he said. "I am grateful for what you have done," she said. "Not in the way that creates an obligation or that is embarrassing to either of us, just genuinely. You changed the outcome of my life, and you did it by treating me as someone capable of managing a fair partnership, which not everyone would have done." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression was careful and also entirely unguarded at the same time. "You were always going to manage it," he said. "I just handed you the tools." "That is not a small thing," she said. "That is not a small thing at all." They sat in the cold, drinking their coffee, and the sun moved across the winter sky. Spring came with the usual suddenness, the way a Texas spring arrived, as if offended by all the patience that had been asked of the winter. The grass came green and fast, and the cattle moved out into the better grazing, and the day-to-day work picked up its pace. Oscar came earlier now, and stayed later, and the 10-minute morning coffee had stretched to 45 minutes without either of them noticing it happen. Ruth Calloway came by on a Tuesday in March and found them on the porch going through the spring account ledger, and she sat with them for an hour and drank coffee and talked about the town and the news and made no comment whatsoever about what she was observing, which told Mary everything about what Ruth was observing. When she left, Mary looked at Oscar. "She noticed," she said. "Ruth Calloway has been noticing since November," Oscar said without looking up from the ledger. Mary was startled into a laugh. "You knew she was watching." "I know when I am being watched," he said. He looked up then, and there was something in his eyes that was direct and deliberate. "I know when more than one person is watching." She held his gaze and felt the warmth of it, the careful intention of it. "Oscar," she said. "Mary," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The space between them changed. It had been changing for months, really, shifting by degrees so gradual they could both have pretended not to notice. But they were not people who pretended to themselves, and so they both knew what they were looking at. "I want to be careful with you," he said, and the seriousness of it was not heavy but protective in a way she had not expected to need and found she did. "You have been through a great deal. I do not want you to feel as though the arrangement creates an expectation you did not agree to." "The arrangement," she said, "is a business arrangement, and it is separate from how I feel about you as a person." "Yes," he said, "those are two different things." "They are," she said. "But I am capable of knowing the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you are. I think I was saying it more for myself than for you." She looked at him. "Why for yourself?" He set the ledger down on the porch railing and turned to face her more fully. "Because I have cared about you since about 6 weeks into this arrangement," he said, "and I have been very precise about not acting on it, because the last thing you needed in the fall of 1882 was a man adding a new complication to your life. But it is spring now, and the situation is different." She was silent for a moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. The apple trees at the edge of the kitchen garden were blooming white flowers against the blue sky, and the land smelled like new grass and warm earth. "It is spring," she said. "The situation is different." He waited. She set her coffee cup down and looked at him fully, and she did not look away. "I have cared about you for at least as long," she said. "Possibly longer because I was less careful about not noticing." He was very still for a moment. And then he reached across the space between them and put his hand over hers on the porch railing, and his hand was warm and steady, and she turned hers and took it, and they held that like that for a breath, a very simple thing, a hand in a hand. "All right then," he said softly. "All right then," she said. The spring progressed with a sweetness that she had not entirely prepared herself for. Love, when it arrives after grief, is complicated by the grief, and she thought about Thomas as she moved into new feelings, and she was honest with herself about what it was and was not. Thomas was gone, and she had loved him, and she also loved Oscar, and neither of those truths erased the other. She said this to Oscar one evening when they walked the fence line together at the end of a long day, checking the posts in the golden evening light. "Do you ever worry about Clara?" she asked. "Whether what you feel now is somehow at her expense?" He was quiet for several steps. "I did worry about that," he said, "for a long time after she died, as if moving forward was a disloyalty. And now I think that love does not work on a fixed supply," he said. "Loving you does not reduce what I felt for Clara. They exist in different places, both real." He paused. "But I also think that Clara would have had no patience with me wasting my life on grief. She was very practical." "Thomas was the same," Mary said. "When I think of him objectively, I think he would have been pleased by this." She smiled slightly. "He would have wanted to inspect your numbers again first." Oscar's laugh was low and warm, and she loved the sound of it in the evening air. He kissed her for the first time that evening, standing at the fence line where the last of the light was catching the grass and making everything gold. It was not a long kiss, but it was a certain one, the kind that does not need to be prolonged to make its point. His hand was at her jaw, gentle, and he pulled back and looked at her, and she looked at him, and she thought, yes, that is the shape of it. I should have said something in November, he said. No, you should not, she said. November was too soon. He considered that. February, possibly February, she said. He smiled. I will be less patient next time. Noted, she said. April came, and with it the spring drive to market. They drove the cattle the 40 miles to the stockyards together, which required hiring 2 additional hands for the drive, which they did. A pair of young brothers named Cal and Jesse Morrow, who were 18 and 20 respectively, and worked with the willing energy of men who had not yet been worn down by the world. The drive took 3 days and was uneventful except for a river crossing on the second day where the water was higher than expected from spring rain, and Mary's horse went sideways in the current, and Oscar was beside her before she had fully registered the problem, his horse steady against the current, his hand on her horse's bridle. I had it, she said afterward on the bank. You had it, he agreed. I just hurried things. You are very good at hurrying things, she said, and he looked at her with a smile she was beginning to think about at odd hours. At the stockyards, the cattle sold well. Better than she had projected, in fact, because the combined quality of the herd was stronger than either of theirs had been alone, and the buyer from the Kansas Railroad was in town and had cash money, which was not always the case. They stood together and watched the transaction, and she did the accounting in her head and came out 8% better than she had hoped. On the ride back on the first evening, she told him the numbers. He whistled. Thomas would have been insufferable about this, he said. He would have been, she agreed. He was very satisfied when things went well, as he should have been. She looked at the stars coming out over the open land. He would have liked you, I think, she said. Genuinely, not just the way people say men would have liked each other. I liked him, Oscar said. In the limited way I knew him, he was a man who said what he meant. Yes, she said. That was his best quality and his most maddening. Oscar glanced at her. You say that as though it is something I might need to be warned about. She looked at him. It is a quality you share, she said. Forewarned, he said, and his tone was warm and easy, and she thought about how comfortable it was to be beside him, not the comfort of sameness, but the comfort of 2 people who fit together in the way that only happens when the fitting is genuine. They arrived back at the homestead on the 3rd day, and the Morrow brothers collected their pay and rode off in good spirits, and the property was quiet and golden in the late afternoon light. Mary stood in the yard and looked at the house and the barn and the cottonwood on the rise, and felt something she had not felt for the better part of a year, which was the solid and specific feeling of standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Oscar was unloading the horses behind her, and she turned and watched him, and he glanced up and caught her watching. What is it? He said. She thought about how to say it. I am glad you knocked on my door, she said. He set down what he was holding and walked toward her, and the evening light was behind him, and he looked exactly like what he was, which was a man who had chosen her deliberately and stood by that choice. He stopped in front of her. Mary, he said. Oscar, she said. He took both her hands and he looked at her with all that focused, steady attention, and he said, I did not come to you in September with any intention other than a business proposition. That is the truth. I know, she said. But I want you to know that what I feel now is not a thing that developed gradually, because we were near each other, he said. I want you to know that I have thought about this about you, and I am certain. She held his hands and looked at him. I am certain too, she said. I want you to know that I am not saying it because of what you did for the property, or because it is practical, or because I am lonely. I am saying it because you are the person I want to be talking to every morning and every evening, because you make me better at thinking, because you are honest with me, because I trust you completely. That is a good list, he said, and his voice was not quite steady, and she liked that it was not. I trust your numbers too, she said. He laughed and she laughed, and then he kissed her in the yard with the evening light all around them and the cottonwood rustling up on the rise, and it was a longer kiss this time, unhurried and sure. He proposed to her in May. He proposed in the kitchen at the table where it had all begun, over morning coffee, with a directness that was so entirely characteristic of him that it almost made her laugh, except that she was too moved to laugh. He said, "I think we should be married. I think it is what makes sense for the partnership, and for us as people. I think you should still own your property entirely in your own name, and I think we should keep our books as we have been, and I think we should build a life here on both these properties together. I also think I love you, and I want to say that plainly so it is not buried in the practical considerations." She looked at him across the table. "You said the practical part first," she said. "Force of habit," he said. "The loving part is first." "Say it again," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I love you, Mary Wells. I want to marry you and spend my life beside you. The rest is logistics." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes to the logistics, or yes to the question?" "Yes to all of it," she said. "Both parts." He was across the table and beside her very quickly for a man who was generally unhurried, and she stood and went into his arms and held on, and he held her back, his face against her hair, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a kitchen with the morning light coming through the window, and it was the most whole she had felt since the world had come apart. They were married in June, in the same church where they had danced at Christmas, and the whole of Dust Creek turned out, because it was the best kind of story, the kind where something good had come from something hard, and people liked to be present for that. Ruth Calloway cried at the ceremony, which she denied afterward with tremendous spirit. Young Danny Calloway, now 18, stood in the back of the church grinning as though he had contributed something to the outcome, which perhaps he had, because 3 cords of firewood split for a widow in September had helped maintain the property that started the whole thing. Oscar wore his best coat and a clean white shirt, and he looked at her when she walked up the aisle in a way that she felt in her chest, a look that was entirely certain and entirely warm, the same look he had given her across the kitchen table in February when he told her he had cared about her since October. And it was the same look, and it would always be the same look because that was who he was. She wore a dress she had made herself from a blue cotton she had ordered from the dry goods store, and she carried flowers from her kitchen garden, and she walked up the aisle thinking about Thomas just for a moment, and she thought, he would be glad. He would have inspected the numbers and found them satisfactory. She reached Oscar. The preacher said words she actually heard this time. Oscar said his vows with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at her, meaning every word. She said hers and meant every word, and when he took her hand she felt how right it was, how different this was from grieving and from survival, how this was something she had not expected and had arrived at anyway. Hector Barnes came to the reception and shook Oscar's hand and said something about the property values in the area, and Mary accepted his congratulations graciously and thought about how he had sat in her kitchen in September telling her she ought to sell, and she felt no bitterness about it, only a kind of clear-eyed awareness of how close things had come to going differently. Pete Holden did not attend, which suited her fine. They went home to the homestead that night, and it was her homestead still, in her name as Oscar had promised, and it was also now their home, and he had moved his things over the week before, and they had put his books on the shelves with her books and his coffee cup in the cabinet with hers, and these small blendings of 2 separate lives into one shared life had made her happier than she could easily explain. That summer was the best summer she could remember. They worked hard, as they always had, but now the working was threaded through with something that lightened it, and the evenings were long and warm and full of conversation and laughter, and the particular quiet of 2 people who know how to be silent together. They rode out in the early mornings when the light was thin, and the land was silver and gold, and she thought about how much she loved the open country, this specific square of it that was hers, and how much she loved the man riding beside her. He sold his eastern 22 acres in August to the Morrow brothers, Cal and Jesse, who wanted to start their own operation. He used part of the money to put a new well in that served both the merged properties, which addressed the water problem he had originally come to her with, and she teased him about it. "You fixed your own problem," she said, "after using mine for a year." "I was working up to it," he said. "For a man who offers solutions, you were very slow on this particular one," she said. "I was distracted," he said, and he pulled her to him by the waist, and she put her hands on his chest and looked up at him, and it struck her again, as it did sometimes, the specific quality of being seen by someone who chose to see you all the way. It was different from being loved by obligation or circumstance. It was chosen, repeatedly, every morning over coffee with the ledger open between them, every evening on the porch, every time he disagreed with her directly instead of softening around the edges of what he really thought. In September, a year after she had stood at Thomas's grave watching the grass move over the new-turned earth, she stood on the same rise and put flowers on the grave, and Oscar stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. She said, "I think of him as someone who was part of how I became who I am." "That is true," Oscar said. "The same as Clara for me." "They are in us," she said, "the people we loved." "Yes," he said, "they are." She put her hand in his, there on the rise, and they stood for a moment in the September air, and the cottonwood moved over them both, and it was not sad exactly, or not only sad. It was the fullness of a life that has held different things. She was pregnant by October. She told Oscar in the kitchen in the morning, over coffee, at the same table that had held so many of the essential conversations of the previous year. He was quiet for a moment that she would not have been able to read a year ago, but could read now completely. He was not alarmed and he was not neutral. He was moved. He pressed his lips together and set down his coffee cup, and he reached across the table and took her hands, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I feel completely fine." "Good," he said. His voice was careful. "How are you feeling about it?" She thought about the older wound, the one she had carried since before Thomas died, the years of hoping and not having, and the kind of loneliness that goes with that particular disappointment. "I am feeling," she said, "as though the world has decided to surprise me completely." His hands tightened around hers. "In a good way, I hope," he said very softly. "In the best possible way," she said. He came around the table and held her in the kitchen, and she closed her eyes and felt the solid warmth of him and the morning light on her face. And she thought that if she had sold the land in September when Hector Barnes told her to, none of this would be her life, and the thought was dizzying. She had a good winter pregnancy, better than she had expected. Oscar was attentive in a way that was practical and loving simultaneously, which was the way he was attentive to everything, making sure the house was warm and there was enough wood, taking on more of the outdoor work without comment, but also sitting beside her on the porch on warm afternoons when she wanted company, talking about everything and nothing, reading to her from the books they both loved, telling her stories about the cattle drives of his Kansas years that made her laugh. Ruth Calloway came by frequently and offered the knowledge of a woman who had 3 children, and this knowledge was practical and specific and exactly the kind Mary needed, and she appreciated Ruth more than ever. "You look well," Ruth said in February, examining her with the assessing eye of a woman who has been here before. "Genuinely well, not just politely well." "I feel genuinely well," Mary said. "Oscar is keeping you comfortable," Ruth said. "He is keeping me sane," Mary said. "There is a difference. He is a good man," Ruth said, with the certainty of someone who has watched a person under conditions that reveal character. "I noticed that about him last September." "You did not say so," Mary said. "I did not want to push," Ruth said. "You needed to notice it yourself." "Very restrained of you," Mary said. "It was extremely difficult," Ruth said, and they both laughed. Oscar was present at the birth in late April, which was somewhat unusual for the time. But the midwife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Ada Dunmore who had delivered half the children in Dusk Creek, said that if the husband was willing to be useful he could stay, and Oscar was always willing to be useful, and so he stayed. He held Mary's hand through the worst of it, and she gripped him with a force that she later worried might have damaged him, and he said it had not. Their son was born on an April morning, healthy and loud, which Ada Dunmore pronounced was an excellent sign, and Mary held him and looked at this face that was new in the world and felt something she had never felt before, something entirely unlike any emotion she had a word for, a kind of love that went all the way down to her foundation. She looked up at Oscar. He was looking at the baby with an expression that undid her completely. Not performance, not ceremony. Just a man looking at his child with his whole heart. He looks like he has opinions already, Oscar said. He comes by it honestly, she said. From which side? Oscar asked. Both, she said firmly. They named him Thomas Oscar Rourke, and when Oscar heard the full name for the first time after she had decided and told him, he went very still for a moment and then said, quietly and with a sincerity that had nothing polished about it, "That is a fine name." Thomas first, she said, because Thomas earned his place in this story. He did, Oscar said. He absolutely did. Thomas Oscar Rourke grew into a solid, curious, energetic boy who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a disposition that was entirely his own. He was fascinated by the cattle, which satisfied Oscar enormously, and he was fascinated by the account books, which Mary regarded as a vindication. He was a loud laugher and a fierce arguer, and absolutely incapable of being still for more than 10 minutes. By 1885, the ranch was running 60 head of cattle across the merged land, and they had hired Jesse Morrow part-time to help with the heavy work of the drives, since Jesse's brother Cal had gotten married and was occupied with his own property. Mary ran the books with a thoroughness that had begun to attract notice, and in 1885, the Territorial Land Office in Abilene actually wrote to ask if she would be willing to come and consult on their accounting methods, which she did twice, making the journey with Oscar, who sat in the back of the meeting room looking quietly satisfied. "You do not need to look so smug," she told him on the ride home from the first consultation. "I am not smug," he said. "I am proud. Those are different." "You look smug," she said. "I will work on my expression," he said. "Thank you," she said. He reached across and took her hand on the road, and she held it, and they rode back home through the warm afternoon light. The town of Dust Creek changed in those years. The railroad came through in 1886, which changed everything about the cattle business and the economics of the region, and it also brought new people, which brought new tensions, which was the character of the West in those years. Always moving, always changing, always a conversation between what had been and what was coming. Mary watched it and understood it as something she had a stake in, the place being her place. She thought sometimes about the women she knew who had lost their land, not to grief the way she had nearly lost it, but to banks and to men who made better use of legal structures than the women who owned the property. She thought about Mrs. Caroline Hatch, the widow who had sold in 1881 and moved to Austin and written back once to say it was fine, but the word fine carried its weight. She thought about the general principle of it, the way the law and the custom and the practical realities conspired to make a woman's grip on what she owned so much less secure than it should have been. She talked to Oscar about it one evening, and he said, "What would you want to do about it?" She looked at him. "What do you mean, what would I want to do about it?" "I mean," he said, "is this something you want to think about or something you want to act on?" She was quiet for a moment. "Act on," she said. "Then let's think about how," he said. What came out of that conversation, over the next several months, was a modest but real effort. She began keeping notes for other women in the county about their legal rights regarding property ownership, working with the same Abilene lawyer who had helped her in 1883. It was not a formal organization. It was a woman who had information passing it to women who needed it, and then those women passing it on, and it moved through the county in the quiet way that useful things move among people who understand they are not supposed to have access to them. Oscar supported this with total consistency and without taking it over, which she appreciated. He provided legal fees when needed from the joint account, which she would record faithfully and which he never mentioned again. He was present when she talked about it in the evenings, engaged and thoughtful, but it was her thing and he knew that and kept it that way. She loved him for it the same way she had loved him for every other expression of that quality, the quality she had first noticed standing in her doorway on the 12th night after Thomas's burial, watching a man set a piece of paper on her table. Young Thomas was 3 years old when his sister arrived in 1886. They named her Clara Rose Rourke, and Oscar's expression when Mary told him the name she had chosen was the same expression he had worn when she told him Thomas Oscar Rourke, moved and certain and grateful. Clara Rose was as different from her brother as two children could be, quiet where he was loud, watchful where he was immediate, with a steady, focused attention that made Oscar say, one evening, that she looked at people the way he suspected he looked at them. "It is a little alarming on a baby," Mary said. "It will be useful when she grows up," he said. "You are always very sanguine about our children's most unnerving qualities," she said. "They are your children too," he said. "Their unnerving qualities are evenly distributed." She threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it, and Thomas fell off his chair laughing, and Clara watched the whole scene from her crib with the expression of someone taking notes. That summer, Oscar's younger brother James came through Dust Creek on his way from Kansas to New Mexico Territory and stayed for 2 weeks. James was 28 and restless in the manner of a man who had not yet found his purpose, and he was warm and funny and completely enchanted by his niece and nephew. He watched Oscar and Mary for 2 weeks and said to Oscar on his last night, sitting on the porch while the children were inside with their mother, "You did well." "I know," Oscar said. "You do not need to be modest about it," James said. "I am not being modest," Oscar said. "I just know." James looked at the land, the evening light on the grass, the cottonwood on the rise. "This is a good life," he said. "It is," Oscar said. "Work for it." James left the next morning with something thoughtful in his expression that suggested he might. In 1887, they built an extension on the house, a proper second bedroom for the children, and a study where Mary could work on the accounts without the chaos of the main room. Oscar built most of it himself, with Jessie Morrow helping on the heavy sections, and Mary helped where she could and supervised the details that mattered to her, which was all of them. They argued companionably about the placement of 2 windows and the height of 1 shelf, and the extension went up in 6 weeks and was exactly what they needed. Thomas was 4 by then and fascinated by the building process in the dedicated manner of a child who intends to understand how things work. He stood beside Oscar at the lumber pile and asked questions in a continuous stream, and Oscar answered every one of them with the same serious attention he gave to the accounts. "You are very patient with his questions," Mary said one evening. "They are good questions," Oscar said. "They are relentless questions," she said. "He has your mind," Oscar said. "He wants to understand the mechanism of things." She looked at her son, who was now sitting in the corner of the new study examining a doorknob with total concentration, and she thought, "Yes, that is exactly what he is doing." And she felt the overwhelming fullness of it, this little person she had not imagined having, who was here and real and entirely himself. The years were good years, and they were not without difficulty. 1888 brought a drought that cost them 15 head of cattle and required them to purchase water rights from the county, which was expensive and irksome. And Oscar and Mary had their most serious disagreement about whether to sell the western section of grazing land to cover the costs. She did not want to sell any of the land. He was not certain selling was wrong. They went around it for 3 evenings seriously with the maps on the table, and on the 4th evening she came to him with a third option she had worked out with the Abilene lawyer involving a loan from the land office at better terms than the bank was offering, and he read it twice and said she was right and they did not sell. "I was not wrong about the option to sell," he said carefully. "No," she said, It was a reasonable option. Mine was better. Marginally, he said. Meaningfully, she said. He smiled. Yes, meaningfully. This was how they handled disagreement, had always handled it, directly, fully, without yielding the point until the point had been fully argued, and then acknowledging who had the better case without it becoming anything other than what it was, which was two people trying to find the right answer together. In 1889, Texas was well into the period of rapid change that came with the railroad and the increasing settlement of what had been open range, and the cattle business was shifting from the great trail drives of the earlier decades to something more commercial, more fixed, more responsive to the markets moving east. Oscar watched this with a practical eye and adapted steadily, and Mary's accounting work meant they were better positioned to understand the numbers than most operations their size. The Dust Creek stockyard started carrying their cattle as the reliable standard at a certain grade, which was a quiet distinction that mattered in the yards, and Jesse Morrow, who was now a full partner in the seasonal work, was proud enough of it to mention it to anyone who would listen. Thomas, now 6, went to the school that had been established in town in 1887, taught by a serious young woman from Ohio named Miss Beatrice Hart. He came home every day with information he needed to share immediately, which meant Mary spent 30 minutes of every afternoon in an educational debrief that she found, to her amusement, genuinely interesting. He was learning to read with an intensity that suggested her own relationship with books had communicated itself. Clara, now 3, had graduated from the focused observation of infancy to an active curiosity that kept both parents alert. She had decided she preferred to be outside with the cattle and had to be routinely retrieved from the barn, where she stood on the lowest rail of the fence and watched the animals with absorption. She is going to be a rancher, Oscar said, retrieving her from the fence for the 3rd time in a week. She is 3, Mary said. She is 3, and she has been watching the condition of those cattle with more focus than most 18-year-old hands, Oscar said. He looked down at his daughter, who looked back at him with that steady gaze. You are going to be trouble, he told her. Clara blinked. Cattle, she said. Yes, Oscar agreed. Cattle. By 1890, 8 years after Oscar had knocked on Mary's door with a folded piece of paper and a business proposition, the ranch was running 80 head of cattle on their combined land, and Mary's consulting work with the land office had become semi-regular, and the information network she had built for women's property rights had helped 14 women in the county that she knew of, probably more, and the house had 2 additions and a kitchen garden that was the envy of Dust Creek. And Thomas was 7 and reading everything he could find, and Clara was 4 and in constant motion, and the cottonwood on the rise was 16 years old and enormous. Oscar found her at the cottonwood one September evening standing at the base of the tree with her hand on the bark. She did this sometimes. He knew what she was doing. He came and stood beside her. He would not recognize any of it, she said. The house, the herd, not any of it. He would recognize you, Oscar said. She looked at him. You are more yourself now than you were then, he said. He would see that. She thought about who she had been in September 1882, a grieving woman making lists at a kitchen table, trying to hold the shape of a life that was coming apart. She thought about who she was now. The distance between those 2 people was not a rejection of the first one. It was a continuation. The first one had opened the door. He would recognize you too, she said. He liked you. I hope I have justified it, Oscar said. She took his hand. You justified it somewhere around February of 1883, she said, when you wrote that letter to the Abilene lawyer. He looked at her. That early. That is when I knew, she said. It took me a few more months to admit it. He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and the September light was the same light it had been 8 years ago, slanted and gold, and the cottonwood moved above them, and she thought about the morning he had sat at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee and offered her something no one else had thought to offer, which was a plan. A real, workable, numbers-on-paper plan. He had not pitied her. He had not told her to be strong or to trust in Providence or to sell. He had looked at her situation as a problem that had a solution, and he had brought her the solution, and then he had worked beside her to execute it, as an equal, as a partner, and then as something more, something that had grown so gradually and so genuinely that she could not have named the exact moment it became love, because it had not flipped like a switch. It had grown like the cottonwood, root by root, year by year, until it was something you could stand under and feel completely sheltered. "I love you," she said simply, to the evening air and to him. "I love you," he said, the same simple way, looking at her like she was the most important thing in his field of vision, which had been his way since October 1882 and showed no sign of changing. Inside the house, Thomas was calling something, probably about dinner, probably at considerable volume, and Clara would be somewhere she was not supposed to be, and the cattle were in the lower pasture, and the new water well was running clean, and the accounts were balanced, and the evening was gentle and warm, and the whole of it was hers, was theirs, was real, and she had not lost a single piece of it. She took Oscar's hand and they walked back toward the house, toward the light in the windows and the sounds of the children and the smell of the supper she had left warming on the stove. And the door was open and the evening came in with them, golden and full, September in Texas in 1890. And the woman who had almost lost everything stood in her own kitchen and held the hand of the man who had offered her not sympathy, but a solution, and everything after that had been built on that foundation. The practical, honest, certain foundation of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what the choosing meant. "Papa!" Thomas yelled from the back room at a volume entirely inconsistent with the size of a 7-year-old. "Papa!" Clara put the door latch in the cider barrel. "That is not possible," Oscar said in the direction of the back room. "It is possible," Mary said. "I have seen her dismantle things you would not believe." "Cattle," said Clara, from somewhere very close to the cider barrel. Oscar met Mary's eyes across the kitchen, and she saw in his the same thing that was in hers, which was the complicated, overflowing, entirely unmanageable love of two people who have built a life together and keep finding, every day, that it is more than they expected and exactly what they wanted. "I will get the latch," he said. "I will check the cider," she said, and they went together into the warm and improbable evening of their life.